Okay, it's wonderful to be here. I'm here to tell you how you need to eat more protein to feed your microbiome. No, I'm just kidding. The most important thing is that we have enough time to chat at the end, and I noticed the person with the card is gone, so I hope she comes back because I want to make sure I don't speak too long because we have to have time to talk. Okay, so first of all, thank you for this invitation. I've known about this course for years, and to actually be part of this incredible lineup of speakers that you have into this class is really phenomenal. So thank you, and that includes our speakers tonight. So it's really an honor to be here. And also, it's great to be here in front of an audience like this. Hundreds of trillions of you, if we don't just count the humans. And the diversity is phenomenal. Thousands of species out there, I see. This is great. So, of course, I'm talking about the microbes in the room, mostly. And most of these microbes that are in this room are in our gut. This is the gut microbiota or gut microbiome. And we harbor this incredible, diverse community that's impacting our health in many, many different ways. I mean, it's really phenomenal. But these microbes can also drive you to disease if you don't take care of them. And it turns out what nourishes them is what you eat. And what we're learning is that what we eat in the modernized world isn't that great for our gut microbiota. And so today I want to tell you about, this is an incredibly complex system, the gut microbiota, how it interacts with humans. It's different in all of us. And it's going to be a long time before we really understand how to target the microbiota to attack it in a medical, clinical sense. But we're learning some basic principles that I think everybody should understand because we can start doing things right now in our everyday life to help our microbiota, to feed it, and make the best of this community that we can. So that's what I'm hoping to get across today. Okay, and I wanted to, so Will sent this story out. This is, the local hero, Moises Velasquez-Manoff, had a New York Times op-ed this past week in honor of Valentine's Day, Microbes, a Love Story. I won't read the whole thing, basically saying microbes can affect your health in many great ways, but the bottom line, they can also, it seems, make us sexy. And so this is a special Valentine's Day edition of learning about the gut microbiota. So anyway, well, you'll see little things throughout the talk. Okay, so this is the gut microbiota. So this is an image taken by a former graduate student in my lab, Kristen Earle. She made her whole PhD dissertation about taking beautiful images and trying to learn things from them, focused on the gut microbiota. So in this image, what we do is we take a colon out of a mouse, we cross-section it, stain it with fluorescent probes, and then look at it under a microscope. So that's what you're looking at here. The bottom right is host tissue. So those are colonocytes. Every blue circle is a nucleus of a colon cell. And in the top left, every single one of those colored rods there is a bacterial cell. So this is the gut microbiota. So you can immediately see how dense this community is. You can see how close it is to our tissue, this incredible interface. These microbes are secreting chemicals all the time, so it's like we have a little unregulated pharmacist in our gut dispensing drugs. We're trying to understand what these are. And then there's this green strip running through the middle. Anybody want to take a guess at what that is? Mucus. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so that's mucus. This is the barrier that we secrete to keep these microbes at a safe distance. You've heard good fences make good neighbors. That's also true in the gut microbiota. So this mucus layer is incredibly important in keeping these microbes, as beneficial as they are, separated from our human tissue. And so an astounding stat, by cell number, we're actually more microbial than we are human. We have more microbial cells. If you take the collective genome of all these microbes, it encodes greater than 100 times more gene products than our human genome. So incredible developmental signals, metabolic capabilities, many of which we don't yet understand, are encoded in our microbiota. And the field is rapidly moving from just understanding who is there, census taking, mapping what microbes are in which body sites, to really understanding how these microbes integrate into our biology, what functions are they carrying out. And it turns out that one of the major functions, one of the major professions of gut microbes is to degrade complex carbohydrates from our food, complex carbohydrates in dietary fiber. And so most of the microbiota lives in the distal gut, in the colon, and the fiber you eat makes its way down there, feeds this community of microbes ferments it, and then produces all sorts of chemicals, including things like the short-chain fatty acids, these fermentation end products. And so here's our first candy heart for Valentine's Day. I'm only slightly gassy. We may as well address this right up front. It's true that when microbes are fermenting, they produce more gas. However, there's a wonderful adage: the only cure for an intolerance of beans is a steady diet of beans. And actually, in some of the human studies that we're doing now, we engineer in a ramp period for people that are changing their diet drastically, incorporating more fiber, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence from doctors that a slow ramp will decrease the symptoms and get you to a point that is just like you were at baseline. So, first Valentine. Okay, so again, another image of the gut microbiota. In this case, the epithelium, the host tissues on the bottom, mucus is being secreted upward. The microbes are the red dots up there, and then the bright red material is plant cell wall material. This is an indicator of dietary fiber flowing through the system. And so I became infatuated with how diet impacts the microbiota during my postdoctoral fellowship at WashU. I did an experiment where I was just trying to understand basically what microbes were doing in the distal gut. It was right kind of at the beginning of this field before it really took off. And what I found was they were largely degrading dietary fiber. And so I was curious, what would happen if I removed all the dietary fiber? Would these microbes be lost from the system? And so I performed an experiment where I kept one group of mice on a high fiber diet, and then I put another group of mice on this other type of diet that we call the Halloween experiment. This is what happens to all of your microbiotas at the end of October if you're eating candy. And so what we found is that the microbes indeed aren't lost from the system, they actually just change what they're doing. So they turn off everything for degrading the plant polysaccharides, and they start consuming mucus, because mucus is made of carbohydrate, and it's actually a backup food source for these microbes. So if you're not eating dietary fiber, your microbes start eating you. And so what happens to the mucus layer? So we collaborated with Casey Wong in bioengineering at Stanford. He created this wonderful software program that assesses where the microbes are in the gut in a quantitative way. And we performed this study very convincingly showing that if you feed mice a fiber-deficient diet, the microbes not only start eating the mucus, they thin it, they get closer to host tissue, and they start to incite inflammation. This was over just, I think, a 1-month period that we saw this. Imagine what happens decade upon decade of eating a low-fiber diet, what's happening to your gut. So, of course, as I'm doing all this research over the past almost 15 years, it starts to sink in, how profound this is, how it can affect your biology. I work with my wife. She's a scientist. We run this lab together, and we noticed that we started living our lives very differently. We started raising our kids differently, eating differently. And we noticed that, so this is a scene that we created to really impress upon people how we eat. There's manure on the table, there's a lot of vegetables. And we noticed that none of our friends, as we were changing our lifestyle, even scientists, were not doing the same things we were doing. Until we'd go to a microbiome meeting, a conference where everybody there studies the microbiome, and then everybody was doing these same things. And we thought, well, this is just us having access to information that most people don't have access to. And so my wife and I decided to write this book, The Good Gut, a way to translate the science to non-scientists, but also to talk very candidly about how it's impacted our lifestyle. not only can the microbes affect digestion, gut health, what's become clear over the past decade is that our gut microbiota can affect everything in our body in some direct or indirect way. It can affect the immune responses that are going on in your lung. So how likely you are to get asthma, how well you fight off a respiratory infection, how rapidly an autoimmune disease progresses can all be impacted by what's going on in your gut microbiota. Metabolism, how you store calories can be impacted by your gut microbiota. And then there's this emerging area of the brain-gut axis where it appears moods, behavior, perhaps neurodegenerative diseases can all be impacted by your gut microbiota. So this is really a phenomenal community. It's a control center for human biology. And so the way that a lot of us in the biomedical community are thinking about this is that it's going to be a great lever for precision medicine. You may have heard of this. It's the idea that we don't treat people as a population. We treat people as individuals. We understand what's going on with their biology, and we treat them appropriately. And because the microbiota is highly individualized, because it's malleable, we can change it, and because it's wired into so much of our biology, it means that we can actually use it as this wonderful lever. But as I mentioned, it's incredibly complex, so the horizon for that is still a ways off. So to what extent can we manipulate our own biology via the microbiota? And there's a lot of strategies for creating tools and a knowledge base for doing this. This crazy idea of engineering microbes, synthetic biology, creating microbes that can actually perceive what's going on in the gut and make decisions in there, respond to inflammation with an anti-inflammatory drug. But over and over again, what we're seeing is that diet is really the major lever that we have in hand right now to do something to impact this community. And so this is just a thumbnail sketch of metabolism in the gut. We know that dietary fiber and what we like to call microbiota accessible carbohydrates, it's nice to see a lot of you got that answer right in the quiz at the beginning, that these are really the primary fuel for the gut microbiota. They turn them into these fermentation end products. There's fierce competition for these MACs. And then there are other microbes that actually don't eat the MACs, but they get fueled by the fermentation end products. So this is this incredibly connected food web, but the major gateway of changing what's happening in this community is what you eat in your diet. And so yes, so this is all connected, but it's connected through what you're eating. Okay, so two very different metabolic scenarios. So I already described the one where we're eating a high-fiber diet. So that's on the top here. The carbohydrates make their way to the distal gut. You end up with a lot of fermentation end products like short-chain fatty acids in your bloodstream. And that contrasts to what happens in the Western world, where we are eating a lot of starch, sugar, and fat that gets absorbed in the small intestine, leaving our microbes starving and eating our mucus. So very different metabolic and physiological scenarios. The environment that we evolved in, where calories were scarce but fiber was abundant, and where we live now. So this creates somewhat of a conundrum. So let's talk about the microbiota in the Western diet. So how has evolution of human diet affected the microbiota? For our existence as a species on this planet, about 200,000 years, our diet has changed relatively drastically. For most of this time, for 190,000 years, we were mostly foraging, eating huge amounts of dietary fiber. Then we started farming about 10,000 years ago, eating less fiber, and now we eat this highly processed food in the modernized world. So going from around 100 to 150 grams of dietary fiber per day to 15, 10-fold decrease in the primary nutrient that's feeding this important component of your biology. What does that mean for your health? And so wouldn't it be nice to go back in time and understand what the microbiota used to look like? Have a time machine and ask, what is a paleo microbiota? What does that composition look like? Well, of course we can't do that. But one thing we can do is we can go to traditional populations of humans that live hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and ask, what does their microbiota look like? And so people have done that. This is one example, one study published from Jeff Gordon's group. If you just look at the chart on the bottom, that shows the number of species in the gut microbiota in two traditional populations in South America and Africa compared to Americans. They contain a third, again, as many species as most of us harbor in our gut. So it appears that we have lost species over the course of our modernization. We have lost gut microbiota diversity. Send a Valentine to your gut microbes. And so, as Christopher mentioned, we've been studying the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, the incredibly gracious people that have agreed to participate in our research. There's only about 1,000 of them left, 200 living a really strict foraging lifestyle. This is them sitting around a fire, cooking one of their tubers, incredibly fibrous material. And so we've studied their gut microbiota, incredibly diverse. It fluctuates over seasons, really incredible data. And then I had this wonderful grad student that figured out how to put all the data collected from all the traditional populations to date, which are different data types, put them all on one chart. And that's shown here. So it's a little hard to see. These are all the different populations on the left, and then how that population's microbiota sits relative to other microbiotas that have been studied. So hundreds of individuals' microbiota data captured on this one graph. And you can see a pattern immediately. There's this group over here and this group over here. These are all the industrialized populations, and these are all the traditional populations. So whether you go to Papua New Guinea, Africa, or South America, if you live a traditional lifestyle, your gut microbiota looks more similar than to the closest Western population. So this strongly suggests that there was this evolutionary state that we existed in for most of our evolution that we've departed from relatively recently. What does this mean for our biology? Great painting from Banksy. This captures the idea that we have these two components of our biology. We have this human biology that evolves relatively slowly, and then a microbial biology that evolves relatively rapidly. And yet these two need to work together. And so what happens when you have really rapid dietary change that can change your microbiome, but your human genome doesn't change? You have this asymmetric plasticity of these two components of your biology. And so we think that there's been this great reduction in diversity over the course of our evolution. What does that mean for our health? And we wanted to test this experimentally. So we actually set up a nice experiment in mice because it's really hard to study humans over the course of generations. And so we gave mice a human microbiota, gave them a high-fiber diet, and then split them into two groups, a low-fiber and high-fiber group, with the expectation that the low-fiber group would have a microbiota diversity crash. Indeed, they did. And then we were curious, if we brought back a high-fiber diet, would the diversity come back? So this is asking the question for all of us, is it too late? Can we just start eating a high-fiber diet? And so we were amazed. A lot of the diversity came back, and more so than we expected. And so we thought, well, maybe this is the fact that we've done this just over a single generation. So we repeated the experiment over multiple generations. We put the mice on a low-fiber, low-MAC diet for multiple generations and asked, what happens to the microbiota? So this is data from the control group. These are the high-fiber fed mice. 4 generations, generation 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each row here represents a different mouse. Each column represents a different microbial species, the 200 most abundant species, least likely to go extinct over the course of the experiment. These species are rock solid over the 4 generations. They get passed from mother to child again and again and again. These are more variable. And these guys over here actually go extinct. So even on the high-fiber diet, there's a loss of microbes. So what happens on the low-fiber diet? Total decimation of this community, compounding extinction over the course of generations. So if your microbe says they're ever yours, it may not be true. So here's where we are. We've had these diet-induced extinctions in our gut microbiota. Where do we go? Is diet enough to bring back our microbes? Do we need to reintroduce these microbes? How important is this for human health? These are all big questions that we don't have answers to right now. But to get at this, we've recently started at Stanford the Center for Human Microbiome Studies. This is serving as a platform for enabling us to ask some of these questions actually in humans, see the health effects of eating a high-fiber diet documented in high resolution, see what happens to the microbiome. These are studies we're doing with Christopher's group, just getting started, but it's going to unroll into decades of studies that establish the best way to nurture a healthy microbiome, because this is something we understand only at a very crude level right now. So I wanted to leave you with this, food preference. We are wired for caloric density. The Hadza eat 5 foods. 3 of them are plants, berries, baobab, and tubers. That supplies all their fiber. That's what they eat the most of. And then honey and meat are the other 2. Yet if you ask them what they would eat all the time if they could, they say honey and meat. So if you put them in a restaurant or in a supermarket, they would make the same bad decisions that we make. And so the question is, how in a free and affluent society do we get people to eat a better diet? We can do all the studies we want to do, find out exactly the right diet that can nurture a healthy microbiota. We kind of know what that is. It's going to be eating mostly plants. And people will still not do this. And so is the answer education, policy, food technology? Can we make a French fry that feeds the microbiota? Is this even a good idea? Maybe all of the above. I don't have the answer. Finally, I want to thank my group because they have contributed all the data and ideas to this. Thanks to funding sources, and then thanks to all of you for your attention.